Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RosieCon Book Festival 2021. I'm so excited that you could join us this evening. My name is Diane Rogers, and I am the school librarian at Ben Davis Ninth Grade Center here in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm also the founding member and steering committee chair of the RosieCon Book Festival. I am so excited that you decided to join us tonight for the fantastic World Building and Adventure panel. Tonight's author panel is the fourth in a series of virtual events, all based on the books and the authors from the Elliott Rosewater Indiana High School book list. This is a recommended reading list of contemporary titles for teens within the state of Indiana. The Rosewater list is renewed every year with new and exciting books and is sponsored by the Indiana Library Federation. Near the end of each school year, teen readers from across Indiana vote for their favorite book from the list, and the winning title is given the Rosewater Award. Voting is online and is currently open, so log on to the Indiana Library Federation website, find the book awards, and vote for your favorite novel. Voting is open through the end of April every school year. Before I officially begin events this evening, I do want to formally thank our sponsors of this festival. Money and support has been provided by the Lilly Endowment for the Arts, the Indianapolis Foundation Library Fund, and Wayne Township Schools to support RosieCon Book Festival. Thank you all for your support. Now for our panel tonight. It's called The Fantastic World Building and Adventure. We will be talking about science fiction and fantasy novels, two of my favorite genres to read. Lots of action, and I love this stuff. Tonight's moderator is Rain Smith. She is the school librarian at Whiteland High School in Whiteland, Indiana. Rain, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Take it away.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you. Let's get on with it. I will start by introducing your authors, and they will introduce themselves to you. First, we have Victoria Aveyard.
Smooth transition. Hi, I'm Victoria Aveyard. I am the author of the Red Queen series, which is the book that RosieCon has been highlighting. I'm super excited to be here. It's a really cool idea. My parents are school teachers, and so getting to see educators create events like this is really awesome. I'm also the author of an upcoming brand new YA series called Realm Breaker. Oh, it's so shiny.
It is shiny.
It comes out on May 4th, so I'm really excited about that as well.
Love it. Next, we have Paula Batugalupi.
Hi, I'm Paula Batugalupi. I'm the author of the Shipbreaker series, as well as the adult novels, The Wind-Up Girl and The Water Knife. I've been a science fiction writer for about 12 years now.
Wow, incredible. That's a long time. Next, we have Lamar Giles.
I can make the tech work. I am Lamar, and I'm the author of Fake ID, a RosieCon selection, and the middle grade fantasy series, The Legendary Alston Boys, featuring The Last Day of Summer and The Last Mirror on the Left.
Wonderful. Yay. And next, I have Alexandra Monir.
Not quite as quick with the transition as you guys. I am Alexandra Monir, the author of The Final Six, which was the RosieCon selection. It's a sci-fi duology, and The Life Below is the sequel. And I'm also the author of the brand new DC Icons novel. It's the first YA origin story about Black Canary. So that recently came out.
That's my next book in my TBR pile. Next, I have Todd Strasser.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having me. Well, my most recent novel is The Good War, and it's a story about the intersection between white supremacy and online gaming. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. And finally, but not last and least, Adrienne Young.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Adrienne Young, and I am the author
of the YA fantasy duology Fable and the second book Namesake, which comes out next week. And I'm also the author of Sky in the Deep and The Girl the Sea Gave Back.
Yay. These are all such great books. And in case you guys were looking at home at your TBR pile and hadn't heard all these titles, please put them on there. So we're going to do kind of round robin, pick and choose. I have a few questions. I don't intend for everyone to answer every question, but if our authors have a pressing need to answer a question, please feel free, even if I don't ask you. But I'm going to start with Todd. What makes for a great adventure story?
A lot of adventure is a really good start. A really big problem, a main character that the kids can really identify with and root for, and just as much trouble as you can create.
I love that. Alexandra, what does make for a great adventure story?
I think for me, it's about having the highest possible stakes. So that kind of goes back to what Todd was saying about, creating as much trouble as you can, but just putting characters in a heightened scenario, a world where just everything is bigger and more dangerous. Just heightened reality for me makes for a great adventure.
I love that. Anybody else have any big thoughts on adventure?
Yeah, actually, I think about adventure a lot in terms of how I read adventure when I was young. And one of the things that really stuck out to me wasn't so much, it was specifically about seeing kids that I kind of could identify with going through complex, difficult situations and striving, surviving, succeeding. And there was a really strong, it wasn't just for me, the stakes were big, but also that someone I identified with was passing through those successfully. And that was what actually sucked me into reading, and that adventure quality of like imagining myself passing through some great terror, adventure, growth process, all of those things. That was what sucked me in. And that's kind of what I think about when I'm writing adventure.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, it is a lot about making sure the audience feels like they're on the adventure too, and not necessarily watching the roller coaster, but they are on the roller coaster. So it's not just about putting the characters through difficulties, it's putting the audience through difficulties and building your tension and stakes and always escalating and making sure the audience never feels quite comfortable, like they don't know what's going to happen next or what's going to be on the next page. They have to feel like they're on tenterhooks just like the characters are.
And I would say too that who the characters are matters so much, in the sense that depending on the character, the adventure could be simply getting home from the store if you're having to deal with bullies, or it could be navigating a battlefield of monsters. The idea that you have to get the reader invested in that character, and then they care about what they care about, and what they care about could be anything.
Wonderful. I love that. So I'm going to start with Adrienne now on this next question. Many people tend to say that every story that could be told has ever been told. So they're just new ways to tell them. How do you create adventures and worlds and fresh stories, or stories we've all been told, in an engaging way that I want to continue reading it if I know the story?
I think that, I've heard that a lot, that there's no new story under the sun. I think that storytelling evolves with like humanity and with current events and, important conversations that are happening. And I think books oftentimes follow those trends too and are informed by them. But I'm a really big believer in writing yourself into your book, not as a character, but just your unique lens and perspective on a story that maybe has been told 100 times, but it hasn't been told from your perspective 100 times. So I think the more personal you can make a novel, even if it's in a really abstract way, I think that it makes it more engaging, more immersive, more relatable. And when you have those qualities, I think even a story that someone has heard a lot can feel really fresh and personal.
Yeah, I love that. Other thoughts? Anyone? Can can we hear the same story over and over? Are there new stories? Yeah, Todd.
Well, picking up on where we just left off, I mean, each of us is a unique individual who has had a unique set of experiences, and we bring those experiences to the stories. And so I think that's why you can take stories that have been told and retell them as, you know, I mean, look at West Side Story, which is basically Romeo and Juliet, you know, but you can, each person brings their own thing to it.
I also don't think it's such a bad thing if there are similar plots. I know if I love something, if I love a particular book, I'm always like, okay, what do you recommend if I loved this? I love read-alikes. And I think to what Adrienne was saying, it's all about voice. That's what you bring to it. Your voice, your own perspective is going to differentiate it. So, I mean, if you love, for example, space set sci-fi, you know, you're gonna want to read a bunch of those, and there might be some similarities between them, but each author is bringing their own unique voice to it. So I don't mind similarities.
I don't either. So good answer. I want to remind the audience too, there's a Q&A button in the Zoom comments and in YouTube, so you can drop your questions there if you have them. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on with some more. Victoria, are you a top-down or a bottom-up world builder?
I'm not quite sure what's top and what's bottom.
Well, top-down is also outside in, and then bottom-up is inside out. So
I guess once I'm ready to world build, usually I have either an image or a basic concept or a little bit of an idea of what kind of story I want to tell. So I know my parameters going in. And then I am a huge map nerd, so I will draw the map. Maps were actually the thing that got me into writing to begin with. I was drawing these knockoff fantasy maps of my brother's video game, like how-to books. And then I started being like, well, what's going on in these maps? And that was where storytelling came in. So I will do that. I will draw a world and figure out, you know, where in that world the story I want to tell is taking place. And then all of the pieces of the geography will inform the politics, the culture, the general, you know, the dressing. And then the challenge for me is, when do I stop world building? Because eventually I have to start writing the actual story, and I have to give myself the room to discover things as I need them, or else I'm going to be developing like currency and trade routes for months, and no one needs that. So I'm not sure if that's top down or bottom up.
I don't know either. I think it's a little of both.
It's nuts is what it is.
I like it. Lamar, are you a top down or a bottom up, an inside out and outside in?
So I'm really not clear on the distinction between all four of those things. But what I will say is I tend to have loose parameters in first draft. And when I go from first draft to second draft, that's when I can really flesh out how the world works. And so I say, like, from first draft to second draft, maybe 20-30% of what's there survives. And the other 70% is fleshing out whatever the world is, who the characters are. And then it gets easier from there. But that jump from first draft to second draft is always drastic and almost unrecognizable if you were to go back and look at the initial world building.
I guess this ties into my next question I've written, so I'll open up to Paula. So thinking about how we develop worlds, do you know all the answers? It sounds like Victoria knows all the answers when she does it, but do you know all the answers about your worlds when you put characters into them, or do they develop and change as the characters develop and change?
I mean, ideally, I think there's always a process of discovery. I mean, there's some moment when the world becomes organic and alive enough that new things come onto the page. You know, it's very seldom that I have like something, you know, whole built, you know, that can't be improved or that can't be discovered as I pass through the world and as I'm writing characters inside of the world. Typically when I'm writing, I work sort of from a conceptual level and then build down into the world. So I'll start out with something like, when I was writing Shipbreaker, I really wanted to talk about things like sustainability. I knew I wanted to talk about climate change. I knew there were some concepts that were going to be overarching. And I knew I wanted to talk about resource scarcity. And so those desires then lead down a level to, okay, if you're going to write about climate change, what kinds of impacts do you want to talk about? It's like, okay, I'm going to talk about sea level rise. Okay, so if I'm going to talk about sea level rise, let's set it in New Orleans or the New Orleans area, which is already below sea level, and it's going to get worse. And so what does that world look like? And you start building from that point. And then you're hunting for other details that you can sort of drag into that world. And so with Shipbreaker, I was looking at things like the Bangladeshi shipbreaking yards in Chittagong. And it was like, okay, this is a really interesting thing, because what's going on in Bangladesh is that they're tearing these ships apart. And because Bangladesh is resource scarce, the process of ripping these ships apart isn't so much waste disposal as it is mining. And so that was an interesting concept. And you sort of drag that into your world then, and you say, okay, this is useful. Like, what does this mean to have resource scarcity where other people's trash becomes your treasure? And then that leads into the sort of the layer of like being able to talk about the characters and how they interact with the world of this idea of scarcity. And then, you know, the idea that the kids who are working on the shipbuilding gangs or the shipbreaking gangs are going to be fighting and clawing to stay employed. And that every time they manage to harvest more successfully, that means they stay employed for another day. And so you're able to sort of build, you know, many layers, and each one should connect. But there's going to be some point where, you know, a character walks on stage and you didn't expect them, something else will happen. For me, like in Shipbreaker, there's a character called Tool, who's a bioengineered. He's a bioengineered sort of creature. He's sort of half man, half hyena, tiger, dog, a bunch of other things sort of mashed together, and he's sort of been designed as a super soldier. And he showed up in the story and as sort of this, you know, oddball, another one of the oddball sort of broken people who lived on the shipbreaking beaches. And it was interesting because he took on more and more life as I was writing this process, went through the process of writing Shipbreaker. And then it turned out he was so interesting, I ended up using him in both of the next two books, leaving the main characters from Shipbreaker behind. Naylor and Nita, they're left behind, that I'm following Tool around now. And so there's something about that process where you discover something that's so interesting or juicy, and you don't know why it's, you know, you don't know where it came from exactly. But you know when it's interesting, and then you also know to follow that, because those are oftentimes the most lively parts of any creation.
Awesome. I have a couple questions coming in that are actually related to this question. What do you use, or what inspires you to world build? So maybe Alexandra, what do you, before you world build, is there something you see? Is there a spark? What creates that?
So for me, it always starts with plot. Plot usually comes to me first, like the main idea. Then I instantly kind of see a character. So in the case of the final six, I knew I wanted to write a story about kids, well, teenagers really, who are on this competition where they're going to be drafted. Basically a competition where 24 will get whittled down to 6, who will ultimately be drafted on a one-way mission to colonize Jupiter's moon, Europa. So the first thing that came to me was this idea of, you know, what if Earth were in trouble, which, you know, kind of is, and what if teenagers were the ones that, for a variety of reasons, need to save us, and where would we go? So it's always the central question. And then I imagine the plot, then I imagine the characters. And then from there, I think about what kind of world. And I pretty much looked at the solar system and picked Europa. And then at that point, then I got to go way in deep with research. And like Victoria, I'm someone that can spend so much time. I went to space camp, I went to NASA, I did all this stuff. And then at some point I was like, okay, this book is due in like a few months, gotta get writing. So usually for me, that's where the world building begins, is after I have a concept, after I have the characters, and then I go deep into research. When it comes to inventing a whole new world, that definitely I've found to be harder, and it kind of takes a lot more dreaming and thinking about all the different systems and sociological elements in play in our world, and how, and kind of like writing them all out and making myself sort of a guidebook of how my own world would look.
Does somebody get inspired somewhere else? Is this a very similar process for everyone?
I also do the question thing where I ask myself questions. Either for Red Queen, I had the image of a girl in an arena who's going to be executed and electrocutes her executioner. And I was like, who is she? Why is she going to be executed? Why does she have superpowers? And every question led to another question and built the world and the story. And then for Realmbreaker, the question really informed the story itself. My question was, what would have happened if the Fellowship of the Ring set out on their quest to save the world and were killed? Who's the JV team to save the world? And that's where Realmbreaker came from for me. So I think, almost all of us can probably boil all of our works down into that first question, which leads to another and another and another. It's like evolution. You start with one little cell and then it starts getting bigger.
And another related question, someone asked how you create such epic battles or conflict within your story.
Deep anger.
Deep anger. Lamar, it's some sort of.
I think the way I create the conflict in the battle, I don't want to make it sound too magical. I've read my whole life. I've studied this 30 years. And so I think it's more of just practicing it and getting it wrong very early in my growth process when I was a kid and a teenager, and writing 7 or 8 novels where the conflict wasn't there. It didn't make sense, didn't draw people in, until I just got naturally better at making it work for the reader through mostly revision. It's not the sexy answer, but it's the accurate one for me. I rewrite a lot until it sounds right.
Does anybody write a genre where this doesn't happen? Do you find you have to edit and work more on revision when you're creating worlds and stuff? Or is it different if you're writing something else? Or is it about the same process?
Since I brought up revision, I'll say for me, it feels as difficult every time. No matter what I'm writing, it's like it's no point where I'm like, oh, I'm really got this down. It's going to be an easy revision. It feels difficult every time, but I feel like that pays dividends when the readers enjoy it.
Yeah. Every new book, you start it and you're like, how do I do this? I've done this how many times now? Wait, what? Every time I want to write a guide for myself, and then I forget. And then I come back to it again. And I'm like, God damn it. Why didn't I write a guide?
Do you guys have that moment I feel like on every book I have this moment of like despair where I'm like, am I ever going to get to the point where it's like first pass pages and I'm done? Like you're in the weeds on a first draft or second draft and you're like, just this moment of like despair that you have to claw yourself out of. I feel like I have one moment like that, at least on every book.
I had it like 15 minutes before I logged on.
Yeah, I do think that there's some point where like you have some pristine idea or some pristine concept, and then you have this rubber meets the road moment where the thing that seems so magical now has been dragged down by your crummy work, your crummy writing, your crummy, sort of inability to execute. Oh, it turns out it's not really that interesting after all. Maybe I should throw it away. And I think I had 2 books where that didn't happen, where conceptually I understood the book completely and the story seemed to move and tell itself, and I could feel it opening itself up step by step by step by step by step. And the first time that actually happened for me was on Shipbreaker. And I thought in that moment that I'd figured out how to write, because I was like, oh my God, this is different from everything else I've done. This feels easy. It feels smooth. It all works. All the pieces are there when I need them. And then I went and tried to write the sequel. And Shipbreaker I wrote in like within a couple of months. I wrote it all. And then I tried to write the sequel, and I spent a year writing a draft that was so garbage that my editor just told me it was garbage, and sent me back to the drawing board again. And another year to write the book. Drowned Cities took me 2 years to write. And it was this real shock to sort of come back to this realization that every book is a puzzle, every book is a process, and every book is a unique puzzle. So all of the things that you solved the last time around with those characters and those scenarios and those situations, they aren't actually going to apply very much to the new puzzle box that you're creating. And yeah, I sort of chased the tiger sort of there, where I thought like, oh, it's supposed to be easy. And I think it's actually normally incredibly complicated. And, there are many, for me at least, many dark tea times of the soul.
Yeah, that's why I like deadlines and contracts, because at some point the whip cracks and you have to keep going, and you can wallow all you want, but the deadline is coming. So I almost use it as sort of like I work best when my back's against the wall. And
I've blown so many deadlines, like they don't actually do anything.
I'm enjoying. I was gonna say, I'm enjoying watching Todd nod to every one of you answering about this. I know you've written quite a bit and for quite some time. So some thoughts on this ideas of revision and.
Well, I actually love revision. I apologize to everybody out there, but I never want to stop. And one of my problems is you get to the second pass and they say, okay, you can't keep revising. And somehow I just do. So that's a real problem for me. It's just, I'll just keep revising books forever. But the deadline thing, when I first started out too long ago, I felt like, okay, I'm going to be the writer who always makes the deadline, and publishers are going to love me for it. And then I realized that publishers don't really expect you to make your deadlines. I mean, they want you to, but it's so often that you don't, that they've got other books they can shove into your slot and push you back 6 months. I think they were surprised that I kept making deadlines. So after that, I stopped.
I swore to myself that I was never going to be so unprofessional as to miss a deadline. And then I've screwed that up so badly at times that I actually offered to buy one of my books back from my publisher because they kept asking about it. And I was like, I don't know when it's going to end. I don't know when I'm going to be done with it. Let me just buy it from you. And they're like, oh.
Yeah, just one last thing. I think ultimately a publisher would rather you miss a deadline and give them a really good book than make a deadline with a book that isn't as good.
You guys have had a way different experience than me. That's all I'll say.
Well,
they probably sell better.
To your point, Victoria, I will always say that my landlord has the toughest deadlines around. And so I always say when it's your job, there's a little bit added motivation if you need to get paid. But to Todd's point, I have found too that if you're just open with editors, a lot of times they'll give you leeway. I've not had a situation where I'm saying, hey, I can't get this done. I just need another month. And someone's been like, no, turn it in now. I'm sorry if that's been different for you, Victoria.
The thread is there. I always know I got to get it in by this time, or they're going to start saying, hey, we have to move the book, and we don't want to move the book. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, I've found that editors are always super, super understanding anytime I've needed a little bit more time, but there has always been that feeling of, but we can't move the book. And so you've got to get it in by. So I feel like for me, my experience is probably similar to Victoria's, where publishers and editors are always very understanding, but you're also aware that, okay, you can ask for a little bit more time, but you have to be able to work with it.
I think you just have to get really comfortable with failure. Like, I mean, the more comfortable you are with just being a failure in the eyes of your editor and your publisher, like the more easy it is to just roll that book into the.
And the other thing is that I found is that when I used to make a deadline, I wouldn't hear from the editor for 3 months. And I realized that's because they gave me a deadline 3 months ahead of when they really needed it, just to make sure I got it in. So.
Yeah, I feel like that happened a lot to me in adult science fiction, that there was a lot more looseness in terms of how they scheduled books. In YA fiction, I feel like they're much more disciplined. And
yes,
that was where I really was an unprofessional person for them.
Yeah, YA, they really try and hammer you into the book a year. And yeah. Adrienne can speak more of this too, because Namesake and Fable came out, I believe, less than a year apart. So how did that go?
Oh my God.
Oh, you're on mute, hon.
Oh, weird. Sorry.
No worries.
I've been over here just chiming in like, yeah.
Yeah. We've been ignoring you, just like we didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, Fable and Namesake are releasing 6 months apart.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Well, I mean, I think when you're the illusion, right, to the reader and to the market is that you're just writing books that fast. And I'm a pretty quick writer, but not that fast. And so behind the scenes, those who have been through the process know, oh, she must have been ahead, right? Like I sold Fable fully written and very solid. It wasn't on proposal, so it could come out sooner and I had more time to write Namesake. So it's, there's this like illusion that it's happening like super fast, but Fable was turned in a long time ago, and it just worked out that way. And it's something we wanted to kind of experiment with. So yeah, it's not as crazy as it seems, but it's definitely not sustainable,
I think that's what the Hunger Games did. The 3 books came out within the same year and a half, I believe, and that really helped with the momentum of that series.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think in YA, the schedule is nuts.
The beast.
Mm-hmm.
To tie on that idea and tie into a viewer question, so I'm going to stick with you for a second, Adrienne. This viewer asked, they have so many ideas and so many worlds and so many things, and how do you pick one and get to the point? And since you're having the books come out very quick succession, you apparently had to narrow very quickly. So how do you get there?
I have 2 thoughts on that. The first is that don't ever throw away your ideas. When you think you have too many ideas, make sure you've written them down and don't lose them, because I have many times used bits and pieces of old ideas that I totally forgot about, and it fit perfectly into some new world that I was writing in a way that I didn't originally use it. I just wrote a pitch for something that I realized, oh my gosh, I used 3 different elements from 3 different projects I worked on through the years. So having a lot of ideas is a good problem to have. But the second part I will say, and the whole point of me saying that is that you never know when you might need to pull them out of your back pocket. But the second thing I will say is that my philosophy on story and world and everything, and I don't want to say this too literally, but is kind of that less is more. I think that sometimes when you try to cram so much into a story, you really distract the reader from the heart of the story you're trying to tell and the heart of the character and the main character, whoever your ensemble cast. And so I think a lot of times I've been put in the position where I'm like, I've got to lose something. Like it's heavy in places it shouldn't be heavy. This is a part where my beta reader noted that she was kind of skimming, that kind of feedback. And then I start knowing like, okay, I tried to cram too many things in here. And if every part of your world isn't pulling its weight, it's going to just feel extra. And so there's a way to have a lot of details and ideas in world building and for it all to feel cohesive and really working together. But if that isn't happening, it might mean that you have tried to cram too much into one story.
It's a good thought and a great answer. This next question, anybody can field. I'm going to try to combine a couple questions that work really well together here. A couple of viewers are asking, how do you know, kind of tied to when you have too many ideas, but how do you know when to introduce pieces that hook the people in when you have all this back information we need to have? How in your world building do you know? Because I mean, nobody wants to read a book where it's like 40 pages of just, here's my background information before I give you the story. How do you know? But how do you pace that or weave that in and know how to keep the readers hooked on the line and going? And I'm going to tie that to a question where somebody also asked, how much backstory do you need to know or have?
I actually think that it's better to leave things a little mysterious and not to give them too much backstory. I mean, the plot is the driver. info dumps or killers. And so I find it fascinating to just sort of leave little bits out, which creates the suspense and helps them continue on in the read.
Only what they need to know. That's the number one hallmark, is what do they need to know in this moment to turn the page and understand what's going on, and just kind of throwing out that line little by little, and then you can get them past that point where they're not going to put down the book if you take a little more time to tell them a little more. So that's a
Right.
balance too, is you have that suspension of disbelief, you have that attention, and you can build it, and the more you build it, the more you'll be able to take out of it. But right at the beginning, it's tough. I also like to start my books kind of letting them know what kind of book this is. I'm sort of making a promise to the reader in those first few chapters. This is the tone, this is the world, this is the character, this is what this is going to be about, and these are the notes it's going to hit. I'm going to surprise you, but you're not going to feel like completely blindsided by a crazy sex scene or something like that.
Yeah, okay. My thought on this is that I try to always, my goal is always to give this type of information through dialogue or through action, and do a lot of assuming like the reader knows what you're talking about. Kind of what you were saying, where it's like you're giving kind of broken pieces of information. I find that to be intriguing. Where the reader's kind of like, "Ooh, what? Wait, what does that mean?" Or even using, jargon, slang, whatever in the world that they're not familiar with. And I think those are great ways to keep the reader hooked and curious about what's happening. But when you can deliver it through your main character's perspective, through dialogue or action, rather than taking a beat of the internal monologue and being like, and by the way, what that just meant was blah, 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 because 5 years ago, this happened. That your reader's already skimming the page now. So I think interweaving it with that action is so key to keep it moving.
I also like to kind of sort of go into a novel and talk to the reader, like especially when I'm writing in first person, as if they already know the world, like you're plunging them right into it. That tends to be my strategy, is introducing them, like pretty much everyone else has said, introducing them through the character, through the action, through what they're experiencing. But I don't usually do the kind of break. Do you guys remember in the Babysitters Club, which I loved, I was obsessed with growing up, but they always had that little break in the middle of the story where they introduce like the 7 girls and everything. And I feel like
I remember it so well.
They would always do the thing, and I would always like skip past that part because I already knew, because I'd read all those books already, so many of them. And so I kind of found that for me, what I really like to do is to just kind of assume, like put you in the world and you're gonna figure it out. I mean, not making it too confusing, but just assuming that the reader is one of us, is like one of the characters.
That's the hardest part about writing a sequel, is you have to somehow get the previously on there. For whatever person picked up the book and didn't read the first one, and you're kind of like, why are you here? Go back.
Totally.
So the way I typically handle this is that I'm almost always hunting in the beginning of the book. I'm always hunting for a way to introduce the character doing something actively that relates to the way the world works. So that their job or their activity, that first scene, is going to have them, their life and their daily moment, whatever you're dropping into, is going to be an illustration in some way of the rules of the world. And so just in the activities of the character, that begins to open up the world. So when I was writing Shipbreaker, it starts with Naylor dragging all of this copper wire out of a ship and getting stuck in the ducts and stuff like that, and then climbing out onto the deck and starting to talk with his friends about like how far behind they are on their quotas and what they need to do to catch up and things like that. And, his daily life then starts to build the world, the rules, the stakes. And I'm so always looking for that. When I wrote The Water Knife, which is all about drought and climate change and things like that, the first thing I wanted to establish was that water was valuable. And so I have a character who's a water knife, and his job is to cut water. He blows up other people's water treatment plants so they can't pump water. So the first scene is him getting on a helicopter to go blow up a water treatment plant. And you have questions. Why is he doing this? Those things are going to still be out there. Why is this happening? What's going on? But you see already the rules of the world being built through the activities of the character. And that sort of can naturally keep moving along in that way. There's always going to be a new opportunity then for the character to do something else that will open up a little bit more of the world and open up a little bit more, so that those details can slowly accrete and become, it's as if the reader becomes a native of that world because they're spending so much time with a native of that world.
I'm going to direct this next question at Lamar, but then you're all welcome to answer. You create such great worlds and characters and engaging stories, and many of your readers become attached, very attached to your stories, very attached to your characters and people. And you have lots of adoring fans. I've seen some of the fan stuff that comes to y'all on the internet and things. Is there something surprising that has been said to you, or that you've received, or that you've seen that comes from your work from your fans, especially from young adults?
I don't know if it's surprising. I mean, I guess I never expected it, but when I get the emails of people thanking me for writing characters that look like them that they haven't seen before, that's very touching, because the truth is I write the characters because I remember growing up and not being able to see many Black kids going on these adventures that I love to read about. So I find that to be quite emotional when readers reach out and tell me that I've essentially created an experience for them that I also missed out on. So that's a lot. And I mean, it's some of my favorite email to get. Yeah, I didn't expect to ever hear those things. So it's nice when it comes through.
Anybody else? Something really interesting or awesome? Just as a side note, in the Q&A chat, Todd, somebody thanked you for introducing her young sons as readers and making them readers. So not to miss that and leave that out because it goes with this question. There's some gratitude in there.
Yeah, now I get, from grandparents, oh, I read your books when and I gave them to my grandchildren.
That's cool.
Oh.
Now the two
I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
It's awesome, actually. Yeah. No, the two things that have happened, like one of them is that hearing from people, kids, sometimes parents who say either my child hated reading or I hated reading. I always thought books sucked, but I read this book and I really loved it. And that was really powerful for me and remains powerful for me, because that was sort of my experience growing up, was that the books that were assigned to me were books that sucked. And it was only by reading science fiction and fantasy that I thought that there was any value in storytelling or reading at all. And so being able to pass that on and give someone else excitement about reading is really huge. The other one that's really fascinating to me is that I've had a couple of people tell me that they've chosen their college majors because of my books, that they've become, either they've gone into, they become environmental engineering majors or environmental studies majors and things like that because they've read my books. And that was, it's nice to know that you've had some kind of positive impact on the world. So.
The thing that, oh, sorry. I was going to say the thing that always surprises me is when readers pick up on things that I did not think they were going to pick up on. I'm really reflective in my writing. And like I said before, like I tend to write myself into my books a lot. I'm asking myself a lot of questions that I'm not necessarily answering, or there's like themes that pop up by the time I'm done with the book that I didn't really expect to be there. And I don't expect readers to find those threads always. But when I hear from a reader who's like, I totally, saw what you were trying to do there, whatever. And then it's always very surprising to me, like, oh my gosh, readers are so sometimes intuitive about the story in a way that you don't expect. And you're kind of connecting with them on a deeper level than you think you are sometimes.
That's awesome. I love that. One of our viewers tapped into a question that's very similar to one I have written. When you've spent all of this time doing all this research and creating worlds and creating people and creating characters. And for many of you creating series from those same developments, when is it time to break up and move on? How do you finally leave? I see your cute little eye roll, Victoria, because the actual viewer directed this kind of at you. My question was broader. But how do you, I mean, there's so much you could go on and on and on. You could probably write an encyclopedia set from all that research and things you do. So how do you know it's time to end a story or a series of stories and develop something new?
Well, with Red Queen specifically, I did end up doing a collection of short stories and world information at the end. And yeah, there was a lot more. Now that I look back, there was a lot more things I can do, things I can go back to if I ever want to. But at that point, I had written 4 large books in this series, and I was a little burnt out, and I wanted to play in a new sandbox. And that's where a lot of it was for me. Is it felt like getting blood from a stone towards the end, where you're exhausted. And I was on that book a year schedule. I had to really fight to get an extra couple of months on the last book. So yeah, it was more just, I feel like I want to tell a different story and go somewhere new and keep expanding my prospects as a writer. And so Realmbreaker has happened. Of course, people say, and I'm the same way. I'm super greedy. I want more of the series as I love, more of the worlds I love. So I get it. But now that I'm on the other side of it, I'm also like, I understand how George R.R. Martin's taken a little bit of time. I understand how someone can get burnt out on something you love so much and could never see the flaw in. But then they, of course, are like, it's crap. Why do I want to keep doing this? So that's where it came from for me, was exhaustion and kind of excitement to go somewhere new.
Other thoughts on this? How you break up with something and move forward? I make it sound so dramatic, but
For me, it was when the publisher didn't want anymore.
There's always that.
Yeah.
Were you done when the publisher didn't want anymore? Were you done with it?
Didn't have much of a choice. I mean, I would have kept going, but they didn't want anymore, so we moved on to something else.
I think it also helps too if you've written what you feel like is a really fantastic, strong ending. Like, you want to go out on top. You don't want to feel like you're just diving back in to try and, monetize something that people like. You want to give the best possible story. And I think all of us kind of intuitively know when we've written a really great ending and when it would be just kind of like digging something back up again just because to go back in.
Love that. Is there any other genre or type or age group, since most of you are well known for your fantasy or sci-fi, is there something else you'd like to dabble in?
Oh, I want to write horror. I mean, I actually am. Like my next YA book will be delving into horror. That's what I grew up on. It's probably my favorite genre to read, and in terms of film and TV to write. So I'm going to take a crack at it. I'm nervous, but you don't grow if you don't try, right?
I'm looking forward to that one.
Thank
Love
you.
horror. Others?
I really want to, I find myself the past couple of years, especially gravitating toward ideas that are more contemporary fantasy. I don't know how I would like make that transition, if it would be a different age group, whatever, but I feel like I love writing more classic fantasy worlds, but it's like you just kind of you evolve, you have new things you want to try and things you want to challenge yourself with, but then it's not so easy to just be like, oh, I'm gonna go over here and write this totally different thing, and when your publisher expects like something specific from you and all of that. So I think there's like always risks involved with that authors are like, I don't know. I always admire authors who are like, I'm going to do whatever I want and I'm just going to go, whatever, this is what I want to write right now. I think that's so brave. But yeah, I think that's the kind of thing in the back of my mind, because sometimes I'm like, contemporary fantasy would be really cool.
I'm moving actually into fantasy. I've written science fiction for most of my life, and lately I just don't really have much to say anymore about in science fiction. I don't feel like I have a lot to sort of add or illuminate about the world around us particularly. And I don't know, I've started also, and it tends to feel like it's picking a wound kind of to keep coming back to some of the topics that I've worked with, which are so, they just, if you want to write about climate change, it's hard. So I've ended up recently, I switched over and I'm writing this massive fantasy novel. And that's very different for me. And it's very, it's a relief. It's an escapist sort of relief to be doing something like that.
Anybody else? It's kind of fun to hear what's potentially on the horizon.
I love all of it. I think being a Gemini, I want to try all sorts of different genres. I have ideas for middle grade, for adult. And actually one of my books that I tend to, almost all of my books so far have been in the YA fantasy or sci-fi space, but I did have one book that was just a, contemporary murder mystery, and ended up being one of my books to kind of get a lot of love, and that was called The Girl in the Picture. And it was just really fun. I was going through, this was a few years ago, and I was going through this phase where I was loving watching like true crime documentaries and murder mysteries. And so I just wrote one, and it was definitely a departure from stuff I had written before and stuff that I wrote after. But I still hear from readers about it, and it was really fun to do. And it's kind of gotten me excited to write another murder mystery, maybe for grown-ups.
Yeah, I love that. There's so many questions coming at us. Like we could fill 10 hours with all of these questions. Thank you, audience, for being so incredibly good. Someone asked if y'all have, I said y'all, if you have tips for, I knew it was going to happen. If you have any tips for aspiring writers, specifically in fantasy and sci-fi, like a place to start or a place to go. Anybody have a great tip? Todd, you have a great tip?
Well, write a lot, because that's how you become a writer. So you can't be afraid to write. I'm sure all of us here have known a lot of people who spoke a lot about writing and talked a lot and made notes and outlines and never sat down and actually wrote. So you have to write and you have to read, because, we've been talking about revision, and revision is the process of looking at what you've written and trying to figure out how to make it better. But how do you know what better is unless you've read a lot of other writers in the same genre? So if you're going to write fantasy, you better read a lot of fantasy and get a sense of what it is. And of course, the third thing is just don't give up.
Yeah. One of my professors in college gave the advice, and specifically, this is really good for fantasy and sci-fi. You can get an audience to believe one unbelievable thing, and to the best of your ability, everything else is supposed to make sense under that umbrella. And you can have a little wiggle room here, but it does speak to the fact that you only have so much with an audience. And once you break that suspension of disbelief, it's almost impossible to get back.
I sort of want to follow up on Todd's comment. I used to joke that the hardest parts about writing books were starting them and finishing them. And it really, it seems so glib, but it's really true that having the bravery to sit down and actually commit and say, yeah, I'm going to do this thing. But then the process of saying, I'm going to keep going, even when, we talked about people feeling like, wow, this is the dumbest idea ever. Oh, this is stupid. I don't know. Maybe I should write this other thing that seems so cool over there. To finish, to push through and finish, then to revise, which is another part of the finishing, then to send it out to somebody, actually send it to the agents, actually send it out. If it's a short story, send it out to the magazines, make somebody else reject the thing that you wrote instead of you self-rejecting. That process of following through, and then try to learn what you failed at, or what screwed up, or what didn't work when you don't sell something, and then continue and do it again and again. And people who manage to do this sort of process of trying something, failing at it, learning from it, and then going back and having the stamina to go back again, those are the people I know who broke through. And it's a process. I wrote 4 novels that failed before I finally had one published. So it just takes an incredible amount of stamina and fortitude and learning, because as much as you want to believe you're a genius in the beginning, you aren't. And so that was one of the things that I kind of carry with me, is that part of it is just like, as long as you're a learner and you're tenacious and you keep trying these things, you make progress.
I would say don't be afraid to set aside time to read and write short fiction. I know the instinct is to go novel, novel, novel. That's what you hear about people selling and breaking into the industry with. But I feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned in the repetition of writing short fiction over and over. And I think you can learn a lot writing a bunch of short stories in a year as opposed to trying just simply to write a novel straight out of the gate.
And particularly in science fiction and fantasy, where there are a lot of short fiction markets where you can sort of hone your craft. That was how I finally broke in.
I'm a big champion of fan fiction too. I wrote a lot of fan fiction in high school and middle school, and that was where I first kind of got the courage to let anyone see anything I was writing. It felt very low pressure, but it was a good way to get my feet wet and eventually helped me in the long run.
Yeah, I think being a failure at a young age really helps, because if you fail a lot when you're young, you learn it won't kill you, and then you don't mind your mind being rejected, but you can live with it, whereas some people just can't live with it.
Awesome. As we start to wind down, I have one last question, round robin for everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I know Diane will be back in a minute to wrap us up, but what are you currently reading that's inspiring you or just finished reading? Everybody needs to go away with a TBR list. So we like to know what our favorite authors are liking. So everybody come up with a title and tell me what you're reading.
Because I'm looking to try horror, I've been reading a lot of horror lately, and I just finished a book called The Fisherman by John Langan, and it was fantastic. So The Fisherman by John Langan is what impressed me recently.
Great, thank you.
I'm currently reading A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne Brown. It is amazing. This is a world building panel. That is a world building masterclass book. I'm really loving it.
Awesome.
I'm reading right now for a book club. This is How You Lose the Time War. And it is unlike things I normally gravitate toward, which is why book clubs are so great, right? You wind up reading outside of your usual genre. But I just had to look up the name because they left my head for a second. But it's Amal El-Mutar and Max Gladstone. And it's like this really short little book that is a really, really cool, mind-bending, very well-written novel.
Wonderful.
And I'm reading this beautiful love story that's got a fantasy element called The Two Lives of Lydia Bird by Josie Silver, which a lot of people told me I would love because I'm a hopeless romantic. So I'm sort of in the early stages of reading that one, but I'm definitely into it. Yes.
Has anybody read The Rosie Project?
I have that on my TBR.
Yeah. I just finished it. It's ridiculously not PC, but it's not PC for these days, but it's one of the funniest books I've ever read. And I'm totally depressed and don't want to ever write again.
That's high praise.
Yeah.
Definitely gonna have to read. Your turn, Paula.
I've been reading Conan Comics, actually. Conan the Barbarian comic books. I've been getting these giant omnibuses of Conan comic books. It's escapist. And then actually I've just mostly been reading nonfiction as opposed to fiction. And the thing I'm reading right now is called Dirt. It's by an author named Bill Buford, and it's about learning to cook in France. Is probably the simplest summary. So he's a very funny, very, very interesting writer.
Well, thank you for sharing those, and thank you for sharing everything. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but this was a great panel tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodness, that was an absolute
Thank you for having us.
panel. Thank you to all the authors for participating tonight. Victoria, Paolo, Lamar, Alexandra, Todd, and Adrienne, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Let me give a quick shout out to my tech support, Felina Martinez. You can't see Felina, audience, but she's here. She's in the background trying to make sure everything's running smoothly, and it did. So thank you, Felina. And finally, audience, thank you for participating tonight. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And please remember that tonight's event was just one in a series of free author panels that RosieCon Book Festival is hosting. The next panel is on March 24th, and it is called Own Voices. We have authors on that panel that represent traditionally marginalized cultures, and it will discuss the importance of authentic representation in literature. Like this panel, you can register for free from the RosieCon website, and be safe, everyone. Stay healthy. Again, thanks for joining us, and good night.